All right, there we go. It's 8:30, the magic hour, and let's get started. I hope everybody is doing well. This has been I think, a crazy month for Am Yisrael, and we this week have a crazy parsha. Parshat Chukat is generally believed. I want to say a few prefatory and kind of general remarks about Parshat Chukat. Parshat Chukat is small, but it's absolutely power packed. It's got some amazing things in it. Of course, the most popular discussion around Parshat Chukat is Chukat and the Para Aduma. And everybody loves to talk about Sadi Gaon's take that Aduma means brown, and about what a chok is, and the oddness of Metaher Tatmeim Metamer Tatehorim, and all sorts of great stuff about Para Aduma. Let me ask you a question. Please unmute yourselves for this. I ask you a question. When was the mitzvah of Para Aduma given? Meaning all the details, including Tumat Mate and the process of the Para Aduma, etc. When was that given?
Shmot.
What?
What's in it is someplace in Shmot, I think, originally given,
Well,
isn't it?
where's the first time that we hear about some way to become purified from Tumat Mate? It's here.
Oh,
But
it wasn't before?
we don't hear about a way to purify from Tumat Mate. However,
No, but you hear about Tuma.
so not just Tumat Mate, specifically
Yeah.
Tumat Mate. So Tumat Mate goes back to Vayikra.
Oh,
Where do we
okay.
see it? We see it in Nadav and Avihu. When Nadav and Avihu
Yeah.
die, so first of
Yeah.
all, Aaron and his sons are told not to deal with the body. Michelle and Salfan, their cousins, are called in to take the bodies out. And so there's obviously an issue of Tumah. Not only that, but in the beginning of Bamidbar, which happens in the second year, we're immediately told about people who are Tmei Mate, and as a result can't participate in the Korban Pesach. And that's the famous Pesach Sheni. Now, if you think about it, it's not possible for there to be Tumat Mate without Tahara. Because it can't be the case that the minute you have contact with the dead, you're Tmei Mate forever, as we are. There's got to be some solution to it, and that's obvious in the course of Pesach Sheni, because the notion is these people are Tmei Mate today, but a month from now they won't be. So there's got to be some process there. So why is the Parsha of Para Duma, which is the only vehicle through which you can become Tahor from being Tmei Mate, why is that presented here in Parshat Chukat, which most believe, and I'll mention the minority that dissents, most believe that all of the events that take place in Parshat Chukat take place in the 40th year. Now, one thing just to note is that the Torah is quite detailed about a lot of things that happen in the first and second years of leaving Mitzrayim and in the 40th year. And there's pretty much radio silence for the middle 37 years. Right? We just don't know what happens. They camped at Kadesh Barnea the whole time. They wandered and went to 2 or 3 different places. Unclear. And it seems like all of the stations that they visited, or should we say most of the stations that they visited, happened during the 40th year. When you read Parshat Mas'eh in a few weeks, and it lists the travel log, that those stations mainly happened during the 40th year, and some of them happened during the second year, and some of them in the first year. Up to Har Sinai is the first year, and then from Har Sinai on is the second year, and then there's, again, silence. So why would Parshat Para Duma be presented here? So to understand it is actually going to go to the core of what we're going to talk about tonight, which is a phrase that sounds horrendously heretical. Can you make a song out of that one? Horrendously heretical. And that is the notion of editing of the Torah. Now, before you throw something at me or log off, let me explain what I mean. Hakadosh Baruch Hu gave us the Torah, and the Torah was dictated to Moshe, and Moshe wrote it down. Was it given the way that it's presented, or did Moshe move some things around? I would say that sounds like a heretical question. On the other hand, Chazal seem to indicate that Moshe did have some editorial license. I'll give you one quick example. Um, when were we commanded, and this is going to go in the inverse direction, when were we commanded regarding the prohibition of eating Gid HaNasheh? What do you all think?
Started with Yaakov.
Happened to
story,
Yaakov,
story with Yaakov, right
right?
there.
Which
מאז
means,
לא יאכלו גד נשים, מאז.
yeah, well, that's not exactly what it says. That's the problem. So the question is, were we bound to not eat Gid HaNasheh from the time of Yaakov? That's the question. And I'll tell you why it's not so simple, because it's a machloket, Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim in Masachet Chulin, in the 7th parak. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that Gid HaNasheh applies to chazer like it applies to a lamb. And if you eat the Gid HaNasheh v'chazer, you violated the mitzvah. Chachamim say it only applies to a lamb. Why? Because it only applies to animals that were otherwise allowed to eat. So Rabbi Yehuda's point is, yes, but Gid HaNasheh happened in Breshit, and in Breshit we were allowed to eat everything. Yaakov was allowed to eat pork roast. It sounds weird to us, but there was no prohibition, and therefore Gid HaNasheh applied to all of them. And the machloket, Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim, is one of timing. Rabbi Yehuda says that the mitzvah is in Breshit, like our friend just said, and therefore Bnei Yisrael are not allowed to eat. Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Yaakov, are not allowed to eat Gid HaNasheh. Applies to all animals they could otherwise eat, which there's no laws of kashrut, so it would apply to all of them. And therefore, today, if you would eat the Gid HaNasheh chazer, you might not be in violation of eating chazer, because Gid HaNasheh may have no taste, but you are in violation of Gid HaNasheh. And Chachamim Omrim, no, the mitzvah of Gid HaNasheh was given in Har Sinai. And it only applies to kosher animals, which means, by the way, Yaakov was allowed to eat Gid HaNasheh. And so was Ruvain, and so was Chetzron. But at Har Sinai, when we were given the mitzvot of Ma'achalot Asurot, along with that, Gid HaNasheh was given. So why is Gid HaNasheh in Breshit, if it was given in basically Vayikra? And so the Gemara then answers, according to Chachamim, Leida Me'ezatam Ne'asar. In other words, it was put in Breshit so we know what the reason for it is. The reason for it is to remember the story of Yaakov. All right? Rashi there in Chulin says something that's wild. He says, Uchsheba Moshe lichtov et Torah. When Moshe came to write the Torah, he decided to put it in Breshit so that everybody would know what the reason is. In other words, it gives Moshe a lot of editorial license. So, like I said, it sounds like a heretical question about editing the Torah, and yet Chazal deal with it. But I'll ask you a different question. Was the Torah originally intended to be 5 books? I would argue no. Because had the Bnei Yisrael not sinned, let's talk about the thing commonly called Chetam Raglim. When would the Torah have concluded? Meaning, when would have the desert journey have concluded? Would have concluded immediately. Would have gone from Har Sinai, a couple steps, straight up through the desert, meaning from the south, not around. Would have gone through the Derech Harad. And that would have been it.
Maximum year.
What?
Maximum would be 1 year.
Right. And now, if you think about it, that means that the bulk of Sefer Bamidbar and all of Sefer Dvarim are only what we would call b'diavad, meaning once we're going to be in the desert, and then suddenly there's a need for all of that. So clearly there's mitzvot that are in Bamidbar that are part of the Torah, so they would have to be included elsewhere, or Bamidbar would look different. The reason I'm mentioning that is because Sefer Bamidbar has an interesting literary style that is unique. It's unique to Bamidbar. And by the way, I'm following the Ramban's approach here in looking at each Sefer of Sefer of the Torah, as an independent literary unit with its own style and its own message and its own raison d'etre, if you will, right? The Ramban, in his introduction to Sefer Shmot, presents this argument. And you look at Sefer Breshit is purely narrative. Sefer Shmot is half narrative and half law, and the narrative in Shmot is very different than the narrative in Breshit. It's a camera on the people instead of a camera on individuals. Sorry, from LA, so I think in terms of camera. Vayikra is purely a legal code with a couple of stories and then a brit, which is part of a legal code. Dvarim is a speech. It's a different genre. It's a genre of ne'um, of speech, of oratory. And then you get to Bamidbar, I jumped out of order, but you get to Bamidbar and you find an interesting literary style that doesn't exist in the others, which really starts in Parshat Shlach. It's true in Shlach, it's true in Korach, it's true in Chukat, it's true in Pinchas, it's true in Matot and Maseh also. But it's most obvious in Shlach, Korach, Chukat, and Pinchas. Balak is not part of this. And that is the following. You have a narrative and you have law. And the narrative and the law speak to each other. Meaning the law is not independent. It's not just, okay, we got an extra chapter, let's plug some laws in here. That's a little silly, but that you have a narrative, and then the laws that relate to that narrative are put there. I'll give you an example from what we just read last week at Parshat Korach. What is the story of Parshat Korach? So the answer is it's really two different stories. It's a story of Korach and a story of Datan and Aviram. And they're two very different stories. Korach's rebellion, which seems to take center place, although really shared with Datan and Aviram, Korach's rebellion is against the Kahuna. And Korach's rebellion is against Moshe and Aharon. And constantly, whenever Korach faces off, is against Moshe and Aharon. Datan and Aviram's rebellion is against Moshe. Aaron is never mentioned in the Datan and Aviram context. And Datan and Aviram's rebellion is against Moshe's leadership, and now we're going to die in the desert, et cetera, et cetera. And very likely these rebellions didn't even happen at the same time. Korach's rebellion, though, which seems to carry the main thrust of the parasha, is about the selection of Aharon. And now, after all is said and done, and Korach is gone, we don't know how, Datan and Aviram, I'm from LA, so I'm very sensitive to this, but are swallowed by the earth. Korach's men are all burned up, Torah style. We then have a whole chapter of Matnot Kehuna, all the special gifts that the Kohanim merit. And Aharon is told, you are in charge of this, and you have Mishmeret Shumotai, and you have Mishmeret HaMikdash, and you're in charge of watching that. And now the Leviim, you get a special gift. And that gift, part of it goes back to the Kohanim. In other words, these are mitzvot that we would assume are part and parcel of the original design of the Kahuna, and yet they're placed not in Vayikra where you would expect them, or even at the end of Shemot where you might expect them, but in Bamidbar. Let's go backwards to Shlach for a minute. The whole story of Shlach is, of course, the story of the Tarim Ataretz, what we miscall the Meraglim, and of the sin of the people of refusing to stand up and allowing themselves to be cowed and frightened and panicking and hysterical and wanting to go back and not wanting to come into the land, and the decree that they're all going to die in the desert. After all of that happens, with the tragic too late 1201 attempt to try to conquer the land and the Mapilim story, we have mitzvot. And what are the mitzvot? The mitzvot are about when you come into the land, you're going to harvest and you're going to use the grain and the oil and the wine, the three main products of Eretz Yisrael, as part of your offerings. And then when you bring bread, you're going to take challah. And then tzitzit, which is just all over the place as being a response to the meraglim. Lo taturu achrei levavchem achrei einechem asher atem zonim achrem. These are all words from the meraglim story. So it's a response to it. Now, again, we would assume that the mitzvah of challah is built into the Torah. We would certainly assume the mitzvah of tzitzit is built in the Torah. And yet it's placed in Bamidbar as reflecting maybe a deeper meaning or deeper relevance of the mitzvah because it's put in the context of stories. Now, we get to Chukat, and I won't go further with it. You could see in the rest of the parshiot. Look at Chukat. Chukat does the same thing, but in the opposite order. Instead of being a narrative and then stories that respond to the narrative, instead of being narrative and then mitzvot that respond to the narrative, instead we have the mitzvah and then stories that reflect that mitzvah. We're entering the time in which all three leaders of Bnei Israel are going to die. And so in anticipation of it, as it were, we're given the laws of Tumat Meit. And what are the consequences of having contact with the dead, and what you have to do to become purified, and what you may not do in the meantime while you're Tameh, and what the impact of that is. And so we have the laws of Tumat Meit and Paraduma and Tahara, etc. And then immediately afterwards, the very next thing we hear is Miriam dies. And then we have the story of Mei Merivah, which either did or didn't happen now, and I'll explain that in a minute because it's part of this mystery. And then afterwards, Aaron has to die. And the truth is that Moshe at that point has to die, but there's still a few things for him to do. But very soon in Parshat Pinchas, Hashem is going to say to him, okay, go up to Har Avarim and say goodbye. And that leads us to really sort of the tail end of Moshe's career, which is the war against Midian and then Moshe's farewell speech. And that's pretty much it. So, this kind of style of story and halakha, narrative and halakha, kind of reflecting off of each other, something that carries through in Parshat Chukat. Now, I mentioned about Mei Merivah, and when that happened, Mei Merivah is the famous rock which Moshe hit twice, and for whatever reason, we don't know the reason. There's so many reasons suggested that we could spend a whole semester working on why Moshe couldn't go into the land. But that story. Now, parenthetically, that story, and this is part of I wouldn't say exactly the problem of Bamidbar, but part of the mystery and part of the allure of Bamidbar, is you read Sefer Bamidbar and you hear stories, but did these stories really happen in order? Well, the answer from the very beginning of Bamidbar is no, not necessarily so. Because Sefer Bamidbar announces itself as taking place on the first day of the second month of the second year, meaning what we would call Rosh Chodesh Iyar, a year and 2 weeks after we got out of Mitzrayim. And that's the census. And in chapter 9 of Bamidbar, we're told that on the first month of the second year, Hashem speaks to Moshe and says, Bnei Yisrael have to do the Pesach, which means right away from the beginning, Sefer Bamidbar is announcing about itself, hey, these stories aren't in order. These events aren't in order, right? And now what I suggested about the placement of the mitzvot here, certainly we understand that the Paraduma was not given now, but it was written here as part of the literary presentation of Bamidbar. Now, we come to Mei Merivah, and that is the story of Moshe hitting the rock, and we're immediately reminded of a story like it. Matter of fact, part of the argument against Rashi's approach, which is that Moshe was not supposed to hit the rock, and that was the sin, is, well, the last time Hashem told Moshe to take a stick and hit the rock. That's in Parshat Bishalach at Refidim. And so why wouldn't Moshe expect that here he's supposed to hit the rock also? So interestingly, Rabbi Yosef Bechor Shor, who is a phenomenal commentator, who's just lovely commentator. By the way, if you use Al HaTorah, mikragdolot.alhatorah.org, which I highly, highly recommend, you'll find a constantly increasing palette of commentators to access. And the Bechor Shor's commentary has just been translated. So you can read it in English too. It obviously loses some of the flavor of the original, but it's there. And Rabbi Yosef Bechor Shor, 12th century France, he was a student of Rabbeinu Tam. He's part of the school of Rashi. Highly recommend. You will just have such fun studying Torah with the Bechor Shor. The Bechor Shor makes the following observation. He says the story that we read about in this week's parasha, Moshe hitting the rock, is the same story, not a repeat, is the same story as the one that we read in Shalach. It's one story. And it's two different perspectives. One is from the perspective of giving the people the water, and the other is from the perspective of Moshe's behavior and what that cost him. Right? And look at his comment, you'll see it's phenomenal. But what that means is that when we're reading Parshat Chukat, we may be reading stories that didn't exactly happen here at this point in time. There are even those who suggest maybe that when Miriam passed away, it wasn't in the 40th year, right? We know that that's true about Aaron, but in other words, there's some confusion here. And that confusion is going to be part of what I want to address here in this parasha. So again, the parasha is filled with great stuff. Every few psukim is just a whole story by itself. And so, again, there's paraduma, then there is the death of Miriam, and immediately the complaint of Bnei Israel, and Moshe, and Hashem says to him, take the stick, v'dibartem el hasela, whatever that may mean. I don't think it means speak to the rock. I think it means speak about the rock. We don't talk to rocks. I know that because I've been teaching high school for about 40 years or so I know what it's like to talk to a rock. Just kidding. But we don't talk to rocks. Dibartem el hasela, I think, means talk about the rock. And Moshe assembles them, and for one reason or another, he fails in that job, and he and Aaron are both now sentenced, as it were, to not lead the people into the land and to die in the desert. We all know the story. Immediately afterwards, we have this story right here, which is, and then Moshe, and then Aaron dies. And then we have this story, which is the following. I'll read the story. It's in front of you, both in Hebrew and English. Source 1. Vayishma Knani melech harad yoshev hanegev ki ba Yisrael derech ha'atarim. Derech ha'atarim is an interesting word. I'll comment on it in a minute. Vayilachem b'Yisrael vayish mimenu shevi. All right, so the Knani, and we don't know exactly who this is, but he lives in the Negev. He hears that Yisrael is coming derech ha'atarim. What's derech ha'atarim? It sounds like it's the name of a famous road, well-known road, and they're traveling on that road. And they go to war against Yisrael, vayish mimenu shevi, and they actually take captives from Bnei Yisrael. Now, this is the first time that we've heard of any military interaction between us and anybody else since Amalek. I mean, since we got the Torah. And something pumped out of nowhere. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it's only the first time we hear about it. And they're successful, and they take captives, or a captive, famous Midrash. Vayda Yisrael neder l'Adonai vayomar. And now Bnei Yisrael make a neder. And the neder goes as follows. If you allow me to defeat these people, I will destroy, now Achramti has another connotation to it, their cities. Cherem doesn't just mean to destroy, although it means that. It also means I'll destroy them and make them dedicated to God, in that we won't build it, kind of like with Yericho. We won't rebuild it, we won't take advantage of it, we'll just destroy it, lay it fallow. And God listened to Kol Yisrael. For those of you old enough to remember, that means God listens to the radio. Anybody gets that? Okay. He listens to Kol Yisrael. He listens to our voice, meaning he attended to our vow. And we won, and we destroyed their cities. And we call the place Chorma because that's what we did. We destroyed the cities. Okay, very good. Now, it seems on the face of it that this happened at this point, meaning, and famous Midrash, this happens right after Aaron's death, perhaps, and Bnei Israel is traveling in the desert, and this group comes up and attacks us. And we take captives. We make a vow. God allows us to win. We get our captives back. Something we're praying for every day these days, and we fulfill our neder. We destroy the cities, and we call the place Chorma. Okay, so it would sound like that's what's happening right now. All right, I mentioned about Atarim, so I want to touch on that. It is not germane to this year, but it's really a fun thing. What is the word Atarim? So the Rashbam and the Bechor Shor both maintain that Atarim is really Tarim. Tarim meaning the direction that the scouts walked. So what's the Aleph doing there? So they both maintain, and this is floating around the school of Rashi, this idea, they both maintain that the Aleph is what we call a prosthetic Aleph. There's actually such a word, a prosthetic Aleph. What's a prosthesis? What is it? It's like a fake arm, right? Good. So we have in Hebrew, we have words that are hard for us to say, and so we add an Aleph at the beginning to make them easier to say. I'll give you one well-known example, but you wouldn't think it was the case, and that is the name of the king, the Persian king during the story of Esther. What's his name? So his name what do we call him in English?
Oh.
Xerxes, right? Because his name evidently was something like, I can't say it without really hurting my throat, right? And so that sound in Greek is a chai, which is an X, and so in English it's pronounced with an X, Xerxes, but it's Xerxes, something like that. And you look at the Tiv in the last mention of Achashverosh, in the second last mention in Perek Yod, there's an Aleph missing, right? So it's Achashverosh or something like that. And the Aleph may be put there so that we can pronounce his name. But that's a little exotic. I'll give you a simpler thing. How do you say yesterday in Hebrew? So the answer is Tmol. You know it, Tanakh, Tmol Shilshom.
Mm-hmm.
And yet when we say the word without Shilshom, without the full phrase, what do we call it? We call it Etmol. What's an arm? God took us out with an outstretched arm. What's the word? Zroa Netuyah. And yet, in two places, both in Yirmiyahu and in Nehemiah, the word is Ezroa. It's often when we have a word that begins with a consonant and a shva, we will add an aleph at the beginning. So Atarim may be Tarim. I'm just saying what some of the Rishonim mentioned, meaning that they're coming the way that the scouts marched. Right? So that might help us. In any case, like I said, not germane, just a fun little thing. And now, what does Rashi say about Vaishma Knani? By the way, here's the Rashbam, source 3, that I mentioned. He said, Harbe alafin bayin l'shimush b'rosh hateva. Aleph, there's a prosthetic aleph. All right, so he says, Vaishma Knani, what did the Knani hear? They heard that Aaron died, famous Agadah, that Aaron died, and each one of the triumvirate of the leading family was the cause of some form of sustenance or protection in the desert. Miriam the Be'er, Moshe the Man, Aaron the Ananei Kavod. When Aaron died, the Ananei Kavod are gone, and therefore the Knani sees that that's the case and sees that we're vulnerable and attacks us. Okay, perhaps. In any case, that's the story of Chormah. But the problem is that Chormah is a place that was already mentioned earlier in the story. If you remember the story of the Mapilim, and the Mapilim is the story at the very end of the Scouts narrative, Perak Yud Daled in Bamidbar. The Mapilim, by the way, which are called, they're not called Mapilim in the text. The verb is used Vayapilu, but the Mapilim are referred to that way by Chachamim, and they're considered to be sinners, as opposed to the Mapilim of the 1930s and 40s, who are, of course, great heroes, people who help people sneak off the boats and get past the British blockade and make their way home to Eretz Yisrael. But these Mapilim, and you take a look at it, the last pasuk in source 4, which is a larger font, Vayered Hamaleki V'Knani, Hayoshev Baharahu. So remember, these guys are coming up in the Midbar. They're coming up north from Kadesh Barnea. They're coming up the way that they were supposed to originally conquer the land. And they were told, the Amaleki are waiting for you. So the Amaleki come down and actually wipe them out. Vayakum vayaktum ad ha-Chormah. And they chased them all the way to Chormah. Wait a second. Chormah? We haven't gotten there yet. In other words, Chormah seems to be a place that happens later on in the narrative when we go to war against the Knani, and we change the name of the place to Chormah. So there's a couple possibilities here. One simple possibility is there's two places called Chormah. And by the way, that's not at all unusual. We have lots of places in Eretz Yisrael that, meaning lots of names of places, toponyms in Eretz Yisrael that exist in more than one place. We have 3 Beit Lechems in Israel. We have 2 Beit Shemeshes. We have about 4 Ramahs. We have about 6 Gilgals. So it's not so odd. There might be another Chormah. But then it would be a little strange for Bnei Yisrael to make a big deal about conquering their cities and changing the name to Chormah if there's already another Chormah around. Now, this is not so difficult once we step back and go to the way that I opened the shiur, which is the issue of editing. Right? And I'm going to take you right now to a text that we need to see that's going to help us out with understanding this, which is the following, source 12. Skipping, but we're going to go back. Source 12 is in Bishalach. It is in the period between Yetziat Mitzrayim, between Kriyat Yamsuf and Har Sinai. All right, great period, lovely period. All right, Bnei Israel get through Yamsuf, Bnei Israel wander, they don't have water, then Marah, then they get water, right? And then they come to Midbar Sin, and it's a month after they left Mitzrayim, and they've run out of food, and now they're starving. And they come and complain to Moshe, why'd you take us out? We're going to die here, da-da-da-da-da. I'm going to give you food. You're going to get food from heaven, right? I mean, the man, right? At the end of the story of the man, which is all in Parshat B'Shalach, you read the following. Vayom Moshe el Aharon. It's right after the ellipsis. They're in source 12 on the second line. Vayom Moshe el Aharon. This is the end. Kach tzinsenet achat. Take a small vial. V'ten shama meloha omer man. Put 1 full omer of man in the vial. Omer is the measure of the man. V'hanacho tol lifnei Adonai. Put it in front of God. In front of God, what does that mean? What does in front of God mean? So I know the song. Here, here, up, up, down, down, right? God is everywhere. What does Lifnei Hashem mean? So we're going to find out in a minute. L'mishmer l'dorotechem. It should be there forever, which means wherever you're going to put it, it's going to always be there. So Lifnei Hashem. So now we find out kasher tziva Adonai el Moshe v'nicheu Aaron lifnei edut l'mishmaret. So Aaron did exactly what he was told. He put the man in front of the edut. What's the edut? The edut is a short form of saying Aron ha'edut. What's Aron ha'edut? a box that holds the testimony. What's the testimony? The luchot. The luchot, Gracie? Here we are before Har Sinai. How do you get luchot? You see the problem? But the problem becomes exacerbated in the next pasuk. Uvnei Yisrael achlu et Haman 40 shana. Now, of course, at the Seder, we always have a lot of fun. How did Haman get into the Haggadah? But Bnei Yisrael achlu et Haman 40 shana. Bnei Yisrael ate man for 40 years. Ad bo'am el eretz lo shavet, until they came to the settled land. Et Haman achlu ad bo'am el tzei eretz Canaan. They ate the man until they came to the edge of Eretz Canaan. Time out. Which edge? That means they ate the man until, like, Moshe died, or longer. But you understand that there's a problem here if this is in Bishalach. Until you stop and step back, and the Ramban's going to say this for us, until you step back and realize, when was the Torah written? The Torah was written at the end of Moshe's life. And Moshe writes the Torah and then edits. So, for instance, Moshe can reference places in his writing of Bereshit using names that we know now. Like Kiryat Arba, Hebron. It was probably not called Hebron during the time of the Avot, but it's called Hebron later on, and so therefore he can mention Hebron, and lots of examples of that. And so therefore he also writes, by the way, as a footnote to the story of the man, subsequently, after we got the Torah and after we had built the Mishkan, Aaron put a vial of man in front of the Edut. And by the way, we've been eating the man for 40 years. One little piece to add to that, which is the follow-up in Sefer Yoshua. Sefer Yoshua Parakeh, Bnei Israel have crossed the Yarden. They are now in Arvot Yericho. They're in the outskirts of Yericho. And first thing, Mass Brit Milah. Second thing, Korban Pesach. Third thing, here we go. They camp in Gilgal. You know where Gilgal is? So I told you, there's a lot of them. But this is the Gilgal near Yericho. It's a little bit north of Yericho. Have you guys ever been there? You drive up Road 90. You guys know Road 90, right? Road 90 is the road that goes all the way up to Tveria and all the way down to Eilat. So if you take Route 1 out of Yerushalayim east and you go all the way to the end of Route 1, you hit the Dead Sea. Just before you hit the end of the Dead Sea, hang a left. Hang a left and you're on Road 90. You take Road 90 all the way up through Bikat HaYarden. There's a lovely rest stop halfway there with a cafe. It's great. And then you continue up all the way to Beit Shan. Anyways, when you leave Yericho, when you go around Yericho, you go a little further and you will see a sign for Gilgal, which is probably somewhere close to where Gilgal was then. Okay. Now, source 13. We'll play on words. Erev Arvot Yericho, that's a deliberate play on words. Bnei Israel do the Korban Pesach on the 14th, because they crossed on the 10th. Mass Brit Milah, a few days to heal, and they do the Korban Pesach. And the day after that, they started eating from the fruit of the land. And that's an allusion to the Macharat Pesach and that whole discussion about the Omer. And then when did the man stop falling? Or when did they run out of man? The next day, in other words, they had man, basically a continuum. They had matzah from Egypt for 30 days, they had man for 40 years, and then they had the fruit of Eretz Yisrael. That's great, like, without a pause. But what does that mean? That means that the man continued until they were already in the land. Okay, now you look back at the Pasuk in Mishalach, and we've got a little bit of a eerie feeling about it, because it's saying that they ate the man until they came to the edge of Eretz Canaan, and now the edge of Eretz Canaan is the west edge, meaning they were already in. All right, so something to think about. We're going to see further about that. One more teaser for you is right here and this Rashbam, and then we're going to go back early into the sources. The very last pasuk of Chukat. I told you Chukat is a gold mine, and every pasuk you look at is just filled with all sorts of great stuff. At the very last pasuk, after they've defeated Sichon, they've defeated Og, and now they camp, and this is going to set us up for the story of Bilam. Vayisu b'nei Yisrael ve'achanu be'arvot Moav. All right, so Bnei Israel travel and they camp in the Arvot Moav, in the plains of Moab, me'ever li'ardein Yerecho, on the other side of the Ardain of Yerecho, meaning they're opposite Yerecho, right? Now, that means the other side of the Ardain. Look at the Rashbam, and then I'll give you, this may work in some of your towns. It works golden in LA. Me'ever li'ardein Yerecho. Look at the Rashbam 15. Ra'ui likatev me'ever li'ardein lotam Shavua ta'ardein. Me'ever li'ardein is from the perspective of people on the West Bank, because you say the other side of the Ardain, you're on the West Bank. If you're talking about the East Bank, Shalahem kari avot Moab me'ever li'ardein. In other words, to them, avot Moab is the other side. So I'll clarify it, and if you know LA at all, you'll know this, and in your own town it might work. I don't think it works in the New York area, maybe in some of the small areas, but anyways. In LA, we have two major communities. We have the community that's in the area we refer to as Beverlywood or Pico or Beverly Hills adjacent, depends who you are and who you want to impress. And then there's a whole other neighborhood, which is either known as Fairfax or Hancock Park or Beverly Wilshire or something else, again, depending what community you're in and who you want to show off to. And each one of them refers to the other part as the other side of town. We call it the other side of town. I won't be home for Shabbos, I'm going to the other side of town. I have to drive to the other side of town to pick something up. Other side of town. And once my wife we live in the Pico area, and so the other side of town is what's called Fairfax. Used to be called Fairfax. Our kids went to elementary school in Hancock Park. And so every day she went to the other side of town to pick them up and to drop them off. And one time she was there and talking to somebody, and they said, "Oh, I'll see you this Shabbos. I'll be on the other side of town." And she got very confused because to her, the other side of town was right where she was. But from their perspective, we're the other side of town. You may be able to translate that into your own, wherever you live. But in any case, that's what's happening here. If you are on the east bank of the river, meaning Jordan, and you talk about the other side is what we call Israel. If you're in Israel, the other side is Jordan. And so Bnei Israel camp in Arvot Moav on the other side of the Ardain from Yericho. And the Rashbam says that's from the perspective of the people who are on the West Bank. So again, when was this written? You see the problem. Okay, and now we're talking about editing, we're kind of getting into a gray area. So let's go back to our story about the war, which is what the main focus of this year is, the war against the Canaanite, and see what some of the problems here are. The Ibn Ezra, in dealing with that, and again, the real problem with this, right, is really Pasuk, the source 5. Source 5 is the real thorn in this Pasuk, in our dealing with Chormah. Source 5 is the beginning of Sefer Shoftim. Now, the beginning of Sefer Shoftim, just a couple notes about it. The beginning of Sefer Shoftim is chronologically confusing. The first chapter and a half are presented as taking place after Yeshua dies, but then it's a bunch of things that happen while Yeshua is alive, and at the end of it, it says, and then Yeshua died. So it's confusing as to, does it happen during Yeshua's career or afterwards? But in any case, it's way after Moshe's gone, and it's all taking place in Eretz Canaan. Vayelech Yehuda et Shimon achiv. This is a famous thing that Yehuda invites Shimon, meaning Shevet Yehuda invites Shevet Shimon to be their coalition partners and go to war together. He says, we'll conquer my land, Yehuda says. And Shimon, by the way, remember, does not have land. Shimon has cities inside Yehuda. So Shimon will conquer my land, we'll conquer your land, and we'll both be able to. Very nice little agreement. Vayelech Yehuda et Shimon achiv, vayaku et haKnani yoshev Tzfat. So together they defeat the residents of a place called Tzfat, which is nowhere near Tzfat. It's in the south. It's a place called Tzfat. Vayachrimu ota. They destroy it. Vayikra et Shem ha'ir Chormah. And they call the place Chormah. Now, again, on a simplistic level, and the way that I always understood this, before I read this Ramban we're going to see, I thought, of course, back in the Mapilim, there was a place called Chormah, and that was the end point of where the Amalekite chased us. Separately, there were some Canaanite cities, and when we defeated the Canaanim, we destroyed them and called them Chormah. And separately, in the time of the Shoftim, there was a city called Tzfat, and now we've got 3 Chormas. All right, fine. Maybe. Let's see. Take a look first at the Ibn Ezra, source 6, about this war. Amru Kadmonim Shu Sichon. Now, that means that this Kanani, Melech Harad, is now being identified as Sichon, right? Because Amori and Kanani are kind of interchangeable. The problem, of course, is that we defeat him, and then right the next thing in the Parsha is we go to war against Sichon. And he's called Sichon. And the Torah knows how to tell us when somebody has 2 names. In the Torah, we did this a couple weeks ago in another context about Ru'el and Chovab. Torah knows how to tell us when somebody has 2 names. And say, Sichon, who Melech Harad or something. Doesn't call it Sichon here. Rabim Amru Kizota Parsha Yehoshua Katava. Watch what Ibn Ezra says. A lot of people think that Yoshua wrote this parasha. Now, before you gasp, let's remember that among the Tanaim, there was a dispute about the last 8 psukim in the Torah. Right? Rabbi Yehuda was of the opinion, or Rabbi Nechemia, that Yoshua wrote the last 8 psukim, meaning from the point that Moshe dies. And Rabbi Shimon says, God forbid, Moshe wrote every part of the Torah, and he wrote it crying about his own death and his own burial and about Yoshua taking over, but he himself wrote it. But Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that Yoshua wrote the last 8 psukim. That position is extended by the Ibn Ezra famously to the whole last chapter, and then to all sorts of other little notes in the Torah. It says Yoshua or somebody later wrote them in. Here's what he says: Rabim Amru Kizota Parsha Yoshua Katava V'Raya Melech Harad Echad. Because in the list of the 31 kings, my Baskin Robbins list, in Sefer Yoshua, as the 31 kings that we defeated, one of them is Melech Harad, which means that the war against Melech Harad happened in Yoshua's time, and that's what we're reading about here. Now, interestingly, the Ibn Ezra is going to protest. I'll say why it's interesting. In other words, these are 2 different stories. What I suggested earlier, there's 2 different chormas. There's one chorma of a place called Tzfat in the Shoftim period, and there's another chorma during the Torah period, which is the city of Melech Harad. Right? V'emet shnei mekomot, right? V'rabim b'mikra kamohem. Now, it's interesting that the Ibn Ezra is saying this, because the Ibn Ezra is famous for being the author of a position that he sometimes clouds in sort of kind of opaque phrases, that there are things that were added into the Torah by later Nevi'im, Yoshua, or maybe later, to clarify things. Haknani Az Ba'aretz, how do you call it? Hashem Yera'eh, right? Bahar Hashem Yera'eh, the beginning of Sefer Dvarim, right? That's Ibn Ezra. And yet, in other places, he's the one who raised the protest, say, no, absolutely, Moshe wrote this and it's part of the original Torah. Okay? Take a look at the Bechor Shor. I told you about the Bechor Shor, and here I told you this translation is available, so I copied it for you. Kwashem Makom Chorma, Al Shem HaCherem. Why is it called Chorma? Because of the Cherem, because of the destruction. By the way, just again, a little language note here. Cherem, which is a Hebrew word which means several things. It means to destroy, it means to dedicate it to God, and it means kind of as something in the middle, it's prohibited for use by anybody because it's dedicated to God. So that's the whole story of Achan, is all about the word Cherem. The word Cherem shows up in the story of Achan 3 different ways. You will be destroyed because you didn't get rid of the Cherem from among you, which is Achan and his loot that he took from the Cherem. That same word appears in Arabic as Haram. Cherem is Haram, something that's dedicated to the God, and therefore you're not allowed to mess with it. And that's where we get the English word harem. That's where harem comes from. These women belong to the king, right? So just a small thing. Okay. He says that the chorma in source 1 is the same as chorma in source 4. In other words, the story of the Mapilim that were chased all the way to Chorma is the same Chorma that we named after defeating the Kanani. Right? So now watch. V'al shem ha'atid shenikra atah Chorma. Meaning, And again, this is the same thing I mentioned about Moshe giving us names in the Torah of things in Breshit that in the time of Breshit weren't known that to be that. Like Avraham chasing the kings to Dan, whereas Dan is Avraham's great grandson. Right? Big problem. But by the time Moshe's writing it, Dan already exists. There's already a place called Dan. And so right, I have a chapter on that in my Breshit book on that particular problem. So he says that this passage in source 4 was only written after we went to war against the Canaan, which happened later. And at that time, the place is called Hormah. Let me give you a contemporary example. How many of you are in the New York area? Somebody, some of you? Okay, let's pretend you are. All of us have some sort of roots in the New York area, so we'll do that. All right. So let's say that somebody were to write a story that happened in the 17th century, and the Dutch and Henry Hudson, 17th century, 18th century. Henry Hudson landed at the helipad at 34th Street in East River. Right. Now, that's a totally legitimate thing to say because I know that place. I know exactly where it is. And you're telling me in terms that I know. But I promise you, there was no helipad, there was no 34th Street, and it wasn't called the East River yet. But using contemporary words. So that's exactly what's happening here. In other words, the Amaleki chased him to a place. That place had a name, didn't have a name. By the time Moshe writes it down, that place is called Hormat. That's the Bechor Shore. V'shem azot shamar kan derech atarim chumem shavu mehem alutom melchama hu omer shaz nitzchum al she'avru should be al zerat hamakom. It's typo, right? So he gives an explanation about it, but the point is that about when this happened. But here's where I really want to show you the fun, because the fun is with the Ramban. And by the way, if you at any time, if you really want to have a fun experience, the Chumash and Ramban, just you're in heaven. All right, so now the Ramban, this is part of what you can see, it's part of a much longer piece. The Ramban is not the Abarbanel in length, but he's lengthy. The Ramban often has like mini essays instead of like 1, 2, 3 lines. Vanachon Be'enai, after reviewing different approaches to who this Melech Harad is, Ki zeh Melech Harad hu yoshev b'negev me'ever liYarden yama be'eretz Canaan al yad haYarden. In other words, he lives on the west bank. Bigvul b'nei Yehuda samuch leChevron, near the territory that Yehuda will take, near Chevron. Shiba Negev, right? V'shama mirachok, he heard from a distance, v'vol b'nei Yisrael v'aderech hatarim el avon Moab. He crossed to Moab, l'ilachem ma'im sham, meaning he's in what we would call Israel, and he crossed to what we would call Jordan, South Jordan, to fight against us. V'zetam vayishma, right? That's he heard. That's why it says he lives in the Negev. Now listen carefully. Bnei Yisrael took a neder. Now remember, he lives in Israel. He lives near Arad. And so he came all the way to Jordan to fight us, and the neder was, if we defeat him, we're going to destroy his cities and call them Chormat. And destroy them. Hashem heard their neder, and Hashem gave them what they wanted, and they fulfilled the neder. Look what he says. And now, during the time of Moshe, they won the war. Etc. They put all the loot from this war into the Mishkan, as it were, something of that sort. Vishlim od bekam saper, highlighted in yellow. That's my highlight. And then it goes on to say, Ki echrimu Yisrael gamet arehem achrei boam be'eretz Canaan. After Bnei Yisrael came into Eretz Yisrael, they went and conquered all their cities. Achrei mot Yoshua, after Yoshua died, l'kaimet nidram asher nadru, to fulfill the neder that they took now. Meaning, this is the way the Ramban reads it. We took a neder, which is, these guys who live over in Israel, God, if you let us defeat them and get our captives back, we will make everything they have cherem. So on the spot, they defeated them, they killed them, they took their loot, they made the loot holy, they didn't use it. And then they continued and fulfilled that neder a generation later after Yoshua died, that's Shoftim, Vayikru Shem Ha'ir Chorma. This is the Ramban. V'umashin Amar b'Sefer Shoftim. This is what we read in Shoftim, and he reads the pasuk in Shoftim. V'sham katuv, etc. V'sham nishlam haneder hazeh. V'sham katuv la'azkir inyan b'chan. Now, I want to say this is mind-blowing. Because what the Ramban is saying is that what you read in Sefer Bamidbar includes a narrative in past tense of an event that took place after Yeshua's death in Israel. Right? He said it's just like we read about the man. Right? That it says the man fell, and then Aaron put it in front of the Aaron, and they ate the man for 40 years. They ate the man until after Moshe died. Right? So now the Ramban has a little bit of a problem, which is, wait a second, what about Torah Moshe? How can you say these words are not written as a prophecy? They're going to do it. They're written as a narrative. This did happen, which means they're written after Moshe dies. So he writes to cover that. And he references another passage that other Rishonim reference in the same vein. In Parshat Mas'eh, there's a little parsha that lists the 14 people in charge of divvying up the land, which are Yoshua and Elazar, and then one Nasi from each Shevet that's going to get land, which is 12, and not Levi, right? And it says these are the names of the people who are going to get it. And there's a list of 12 names, along with Yoshua and Elazar. And he says, Nevu'ah shiyu chayim mekayamim, meaning that there's a nevuah there that these 12 people are going to stay alive all the way through the wars and be there to help divide up the land. Because otherwise, how can Hashem say, these are the guys who are going to give you the land if some of them may die in the meantime? They're not getting the land right away. They have to fight for it. Right? It would have made more sense for Hashem to tell Yoshua after the wars, these are the 12 guys. Why does Hashem do it in Moshe's life? It's a nevuah that they'll be alive. But you understand that the Ramban here is opening the door to a very different approach, which is to understand that perhaps a few of these lines in the Torah are added in later on, bin nevuah, of course, in order to complete a story, like the man, and like this. Now, you quote the Ramban, and it's the Ramban is saying, but take a look at the Sforno here. The Sforno here says in source 9, nadru az lasotam cherem bikansam la'aretz. They took a neder that when they come into the land, they'll do it. V'chein asu, and they did it. They did conquer the cities and make them cherem. But if you notice in source 1, it describes it as a past tense event, meaning they did do it, not they will do it. Right? So to top this off, we have 7 minutes. So again, Parshat Chukat. I don't know if it's come across. I just love this parsha, and there's so many lovely things in this parsha. So many really powerful things, and so many interesting, intriguing things, and there's locations, and it's really powerful. There are a couple other notes in here that are of interest, and I'll share them with you over the course of the next couple minutes. And some of this is, and then Idach Perusha Zilgmor. Like this is here's the basic thing. The rest is commentary. Go and study. Right after the story that we just read, they camp at a place called Ovot. They camp at a place called Iye Avarim, which is in front of Moab. They camp in Nachal Zered, which is a nachal that comes out of the Dead Sea. Misham nasav yachanu me'evar Arnon asher b'midbar ayotze migvul ha'amori. Ki Arnon gvul Moab ben Moab ben Amori. And it's giving us locations. And you take a look at a map, you can see where these are. These are all sort of parallel with the southern tip of the Dead Sea, about 20, 30 kilometers east. Al Kenye Amar. And now there's this weird pasuk. B'Sefer Melchamot Adonai. Therefore, it says in the book of the wars of the Lord, Et vahem v'sufa et hanachalim arnon v'esh hanachalim asher natan shabbat ar nisham l'gvul Moav sham be'er haya be'er shamar Adonai Moshe sofatam et nalem mayim. This whole thing is in Sefer Melchamot Hashem. What is Sefer Melchamot Hashem? So Rashi says Sefer Melchamot Hashem means sipur. When people talk about God's wars, they have this little witty little pitgam that talks about the places they traveled and their victories on the way. But look at the Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra here says Sefer Melchamot Hashem, Sefer Hiya B'fnei Atzmo. There was a book. V'sham katuv Melchamot Hashem Bavur Yirayav, meaning there was a book that they had that kept a track of all of God's wars for those who fear Him, meaning that they could look at it and review. And v'yitachen shayam imot Avraham. Maybe this book was around since the time of Avraham. Ki sfarim rabim avadu. We have a lot of books that we had that are lost. Maybe there was a book. Those following Daf Yomi. Just a couple days ago, we read about, in Avram's day, there was a book about Avodah Zarah that had 400 chapters. We don't have that book. And he mentions a lot of books that are referenced, a number of books that are referenced in Tanakh. So, for instance, when Yeshua stops the sun and the moon, it says, "Halo ichtuv Sefer Yashar." It's written in Sefer Yashar, right? When David utters his lamentation for Shaul and Yonatan, it's also Sefer Yashar. We have throughout Sefer Malachim, it's all written in the Divrei Yamim, the Malchei Yehuda, the Malchei Israel, in Megillat Esther, Malchei Madai Faras. There are also the books that are referenced. Sefer Melchamot Hashem is one of those. So again, there's these teasers of all sorts of other things going on outside of the text that we're not familiar with that we get here in this story. So I want to leave you with the last thing, and I'll just let you know that this was the cause of a huge blow up in the 1970s, which now we could talk about as being a long time ago, and was I was in yeshiva at the time, and that was the following. And right after the passage we just mentioned, we have this song at the well, Shirat HaBe'er. And if you read it, it's a little bit strange, because it says, Az Yashir Yisrael Tashira Zot, Ali Ve'er Enula. They sang the song, Come Up, O Be'er. It's kind of strange. They're singing a song to a well, and then they talk about the well, and the well was dug by leaders, etc., and then they go from one place to another. You got to wonder what's going on. It's a little bit strange, because you would think if they're singing a song that they came in the middle of the desert to a well and they have water, they would sing to Hashem. They would thank Hashem for taking care of them, and they mention the bear. So in 1975, here's the story very quickly. In 1975, a particular scholar, Yitzchak Langa in Switzerland, published a manuscript of the commentaries of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, that's Rabbi Yehuda of Regensburg in the 13th century, who was considered to be sort of the founder of the Hasidei Ashkenaz movement, of the Pietistic movement, the author of the very famous Sefer Hasidim. He published Rabbi Yehuda Chassid's commentary on the Torah. And it was really it wasn't written by Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, it was written by his son, who took notes from the shiurim that his father gave at Shalosh Seudos every week. And so he would take notes, and then he would, I guess, review it with his father. And it was a manuscript. And it was a manuscript that was well known in the time of the Rishonim. Other Rishonim quote it, and they quote it favorably, and a lot of very interesting things in there, some very innovative things. And there were 3 comments in there that were so offensive to, I guess, standard doctrine, that the claim was made without any doubt that this was a forgery. There's no way in the world Rabbi Yehuda Chassid would say such things. And one of them is what you're looking at here. All of the evidence we have points to this being not a forgery and being legitimate. And these are comments that, again, were quoted by other Rishonim in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, and favorably. And some unusual. All right, he has one comment about the famous hand switch about Menashe and Ephraim. He has another comment in elsewhere in Dvarim, but here he talks about the Shirat HaBe'er, and he just says the following thing. He says, look, Bnei Israel sang songs in the Midbar. They sang songs to Hashem, thanking Him. Where did those songs end up? Those songs ended up in Sefer Tehillim. Now, I know it sounds strange, but Chazal say that. because Chazal say, when did they say Hallel Hagadol? Hallel Hagadol, the 26 lines of Kilam Chasto, said that in the desert, thanking God for feeding them. After all, what's the penultimate line? Noten lachem ochel basar kilam chasto. And so he says, that's what this is. Look at the first line. Az yishvat hashirazot, piresh mori avi, zeu halel hagadol. Right? So then he explains the other psukim as not being the song they sang, it's stuff about the song. But the song itself was clipped out, and he said, and David took it, watch him, right? I'm just going to say, David took it and put it into Tehillim. Kind of clipped it out. And that, of course, raised tremendous anger and upsetness. But there it is in front of you. I'll tell you why I'm sharing it with you. I'm sharing it with you because, first of all, it's always fun to see things that are different than what we're used to. We have to expand our possibilities. But I'll tell you as a teacher why I think it's valid and important to share this. If people understand how very broad and wide the tent of Torah is, and that it's their job to explore the different corners and to find the area, the commentator, the approach that fits them best. And it may shift during their life. And to know that they have a home, what we call chelek b'Torah, that is of inestimable value. If they think that there's only one way to look at things, which is take it or leave it, then a lot of people are going to leave it. And they may give lip service to it, but they're not really going to internalize it. They won't be interested in learning, and they won't internalize it. And it's very hard to pass that on to another generation. When you're excited about what you're learning because you suddenly found something that resonates with you and it's within the very, very broad tent. I don't mean to say everything's okay, but in the very broad tent of Torah, then suddenly it gives you life. And it gives you, and then you talk to somebody and you share one thing and they share another thing, and you grow from each other. And so I think it's critical to be able to see the wide expanse of different approaches. This is something I hope we did over the course of an hour tonight. In any case, everybody have a great Shabbos. Enjoy Parshat Chukat. And
I have a question, Rabbi Etshalom, I have a question.
Fire away.
According to our Masorah, all the women went into Eretz Yisrael. The men died from that generation, and the women went into Eretz Yisrael. So why did Miriam die? Why didn't she go in with the other women to Eretz Yisrael?
Right. So that's an interesting question about whether all the women went in, because that of course is going to leave us with an age problem and a family problem, right? The simple read of the text is not like that. The simple read of the text is that the entire generation, I mean men, women, who left Egypt did not make it to the land, with the exception of Yoshua and Caleb. And whether you want to make the argument, which many Rishonim take, which is that Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam all passed away in the desert because they were part of that generation, and the decree was on everybody, or you want to say that it's because of individual sins, like the famous Abrabanel, that Moshe, that Aaron died because of his part in the Chet HaEgel, and Miriam because of Lashon Hara, whatever, that they had a particular thing that they were held responsible for, and that's why they died. But you're right, because that particular tradition about the women really does run afoul of the reality of Miriam dying. Right. Yeah. And where's Slavchad's wife in this whole thing? You ever ask about that? All right. Anyhow, there's a lot of fun. Have a great Shabbat and a wonderful Sabbath, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi Yitz. Thank you so much.